Hey there to all you philosophy fans out there. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive deep.
Well, today we're going to explore the connection between David Hume and Isaac Newton.
Two giants of thought.
And yeah, I mean, it's pretty fascinating to see like how their ideas kind of intertwine.
Yeah. Was Hume like a follower of Newton or a critic or something else altogether? It's complicated.
Yeah, definitely not a simple answer.
Yeah.
So to get into this, we're mainly using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Hume's Newtonianism and Anti-Newtonianism.
Right. It's a great scholarly analysis, really digs deep into this topic.
Yeah, so our philosopher listeners out there, get ready to like really unpack this relationship between these two guys. We're going to look at where Newton influenced Hume and where their ideas diverged. And maybe the coolest part is like how Hume kind of reinterpreted Newton's science from a philosopher's point of view.
Yeah, exactly. We're not just going to say follower or opponent. We're going to go way beyond that.
For sure. So like first off, it's important to acknowledge like the common view that Hume's science of man was kind of modeled after Newton's success in natural philosophy. I mean, even Hume's language reflects this, right?
Totally. He uses terms like experimental method and talks about rules of reasoning, which, very much aligns with Newton's approach.
Yeah, it's not just like superficial similarities either.
Mm.
Hume actually uses Newtonian imagery when he's explaining his philosophy.
Like what? Give us an example.
Okay, so for example, he talks about attraction in the mental world, which kind of mirrors Newton's idea of gravitational attraction. And he talks about habits working like a mental force, which again is very similar to the idea of gravity.
Right, and he even compared his own discovery of like the principles of association to Newton's laws of motion. He said they have like a similar role, but in the mental world.
Exactly. Plus, Hume kind of invites this comparison himself. Like in the intro to his treatise and in the inquiry, he kind of hints that his science of man is on par with the big achievements in natural philosophy. And he's clearly thinking about Newton there.
Yeah, and he even rejects hypotheses, like Newton did right at the beginning of the inquiry concerning the principles of morals. So he's really placing himself within this empirical tradition.
Okay, so it really seems like Hume is building on Newton's work. But here's where things get a bit trickier, more interesting for us philosophy nerds. Despite all this, you don't really see the nitty-gritty details of Newton's philosophy in most of Hume's writing.
It's true. Actually, some of the most detailed discussions about Newton's philosophy and Hume's work come from Cleanthes in the dialogues concerning natural religion. But even there, it's debated how much Cleanthes represents Hume's own views. So it's not clear-cut whether Hume fully agrees with the Newtonian design argument.
So it's not just a straightforward case of one guy following another. And this raises a really cool possibility. Maybe Hume was using these so-called Newtonian principles to kind of critique some aspects of Newtonianism itself.
Now, that's a thought. An internal critic, as they say.
Yeah, like think about the design argument, right? Both Hume and Newton appeal to experience. But then Hume uses this very idea of experience to actually dismantle the design argument. Like our experience doesn't support the idea of a godlike designer creating the universe.
Oh, that's brilliant. Using Newton's own tool against him.
And this critique goes further. It even challenges the idea of scientific entities themselves.
Right, like when Hume attacks invisible or theoretical entities.
Yeah, like substantial forms or occult powers, or even just the idea of mass as this separate thing from what we actually observe.
Right. He's basically saying maybe these Newtonian laws aren't actually revealing the true mechanisms of the universe. Maybe they're just descriptions of what we see happening regularly.
Exactly. And that's a huge deal for how we think about scientific realism even today.
Absolutely. And all of this fits with the image of Hume as this big skeptic. But more recently, some scholars have focused on the naturalistic parts of his philosophy.
Okay, so how does that play into all of this?
Well, as philosophical naturalism became more popular, scholars started emphasizing the ways Hume's philosophy aligned with that. They sometimes even downplayed his skepticism. But here's the thing. If we're saying that naturalism means just blindly accepting what science says, then that actually clashes with Hume's critical side.
So we can't just assume he agrees with everything Newton says just because he's a naturalist.
Exactly. It's not that simple.
So it's clear that this relationship between Hume and Newton is way more complex than just one guy following the other. And it seems like there are a lot of different ways to look at it.
Yeah, and there are some traps we gotta avoid in this kind of scholarship. Like, sometimes people interpret Hume's arguments without considering the historical context. They forget he was responding to specific thinkers like Descartes or Locke or Malebranche or Berkeley.
Interesting. So even when talking about Newton, we need to remember the broader intellectual landscape.
Definitely. And another problem is that even when scholars do focus on the historical Hume, they sometimes don't really understand the specifics of Newton's natural philosophy. They rely on simplified accounts or textbooks from Hume's time instead of looking at Newton's actual work.
So they're not really comparing apples to apples.
Exactly. Plus, even some of the best Hume scholarship ignores the newer work that's been done on Newton. Our understanding of Newton is always evolving, and that should definitely affect how we see Hume's relationship to him.
So we got to be careful not to oversimplify things on either side of the equation. Okay, but let's get into Hume's own thoughts about Newton. What did he actually say about the guy?
Well, the source describes it as an ambivalent picture. He definitely respects Newton's achievements, like, big time. He talks about how much scrutiny Newton's theories faced, especially from continental thinkers, and he predicts that they'll ultimately win out. He even puts Galileo and Newton at the top of humankind when it comes to genius.
So that sounds like high praise. Where's the ambivalent?
Well, right after that, he says that Newton's work doesn't have virtue or usefulness to the public from a moral standpoint. For Hume, who really cared about morality and how philosophy could make society better, this is kind of a dig. Like, Newton's work might be intellectually amazing, but it's not clear how it directly helps people.
That's a very Humean way to look at it.
Yeah.
And this ambivalence pops up again in his History of England, right?
Yeah, he calls Newton the greatest and rarest genius that ever arose, but then he says that Newton was kind of oblivious to how much smarter he was than everyone else. And this, plus the fact that his theories were so abstract, meant that it took a long time for the world to recognize him.
So Newton's genius was almost hidden because he wasn't good at connecting with people.
That's what Hume suggests. Like, if Newton had been better at understanding his audience and the intellectual climate of his time, he could have spread his ideas more effectively. And the source points out that Hume actually misses some of the ways Newton tried to make his arguments accessible in the Principia.
Yeah.
Like, he deliberately avoided using super complex math so he wouldn't alienate people who couldn't follow it.
Huh, interesting. So Hume's criticizing Newton not just for being detached from everyday concerns, but also for not being the best at explaining his own brilliance.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing about Newton's religious beliefs and stuff, right?
Yeah. Hume mentions that Newton spent a lot of time writing about the Book of Revelation. He even tried to calculate when the papacy would fall and said the Pope was the Antichrist. Hume uses this as an example of how even super smart people can fall for superstitious prejudices. But it's important to note that Hume didn't think Newton was being insincere in his beliefs. It's more like he was criticizing the fact that even Newton could be irrational sometimes.
So Hume saw Newton as this incredible mind, but also as a flawed human being with blind spots. And this brings us to Hume's own philosophical project, his Science of Man, right?
Exactly. It's like both a continuation of and a response to Newton's work.
Okay, so how so?
Well, in his Treatise of Human Nature and the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Hume says that there is no question of importance whose decision is not comprised in the science of man. He's arguing that understanding human nature is the foundation for all other knowledge. So in a way, his project is even more fundamental than Newton's.
Wow, that's a bold claim. He's saying his philosophy is even more important than Newton's science.
Yeah, and he gets really specific about what this science of man includes. He focuses on logic, morals, criticism meaning aesthetics, and politics, which is like what we call political economy today. He says that advancements in these areas are way more important for Britain than progress in natural philosophy because they directly affect human well-being.
So he's directly challenging the idea that natural philosophy is the most important intellectual pursuit.
He is. At the end of the treatise intro, he even says he hopes this science of man will be much superior in utility to any other field of knowledge. And he goes even further. He says that even things like mathematics, natural philosophy, and natural religion are in some measure dependent on the science of man.
So basically all knowledge ultimately comes back to understanding human nature.
That's Hume's view. It's not just another area of study. It's the foundation for how we understand and evaluate everything else.
And this must have shaped how he saw the limits of Newtonian science.
For sure. A core part of Hume's science of man is recognizing that human cognition has limits. He develops this idea of mitigated skepticism, which basically says we shouldn't overreach intellectually. We got to stay grounded in common life. Understanding our cognitive limitations keeps us from getting lost in abstract metaphysical systems.
So his philosophy is like a safeguard against overly ambitious scientific claims.
Yeah, and that includes maybe some of Newton's ideas.
Okay, so we talked about this a bit earlier, but let's get specific. Did Hume actually have a deep understanding of Newton's work?
Surprisingly, there's not much direct evidence that he did. We mostly have to piece things together from what we know about his education, his library, and hints in his writing. There's some research suggesting that during his time as a student in Edinburgh, he probably encountered a lot of work in the new natural philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. They emphasized Robert Boyle's methods a lot, apparently.
So Boyle was maybe a bigger influence than Newton?
Could be. And then when he was at the Jesuit college at La Flèche, he definitely encountered Descartes and Malebranche. Some people argue they had a bigger impact on his ideas about causation and natural theology than Newton did. It's likely he knew some of Newton's optics, particularly the stuff about colors, but whether he really knew the Principia Mathematica is less clear.
Well, to understand the Principia, you need some serious math skills, right?
For sure. And we don't actually know how good Hume was at math. We know he attended lectures on fluxions, Newton's version of calculus. But when you look at his notes, there's not a lot of evidence that he applied this advanced math to his work on natural philosophy. Plus, some of his discussions about math seem to be influenced by Bishop Berkeley's criticisms of Newtonian mathematics. So it's unlikely he had a deep understanding of the really technical stuff in the Principia.
So maybe he focused more on the big picture of Newton's method and less on the complicated math behind it.
Right. And in his History of England, he talks about Newton's methodology being cautious, experimental, and bold in the way he adopted principles based on evidence. He compares Newton's method to Boyle's, especially in their emphasis on caution and observation. But importantly, he doesn't say they agree on the nature of those principles.
So they both believed in observing the world carefully, but they might have disagreed on the kinds of explanations they were looking for.
Exactly. And this leads to a fundamental difference in their thinking about these scientific principles. In the treatise, Hume argues that we can't really understand the nature of bodies or the secret causes behind how things work. He's drawing on his science of man here and saying it's just beyond human understanding. So he wouldn't agree with Newton's goal in the general scholium of the Principia, where Newton wants to investigate the nature of matter and its forces.
So Newton wanted to understand the deep inner workings of the universe, while Hume said that's just not possible for us. And this difference comes from some of the core ideas in Hume's philosophy, right? Like his famous copy principle.
Exactly. That's the idea that all our simple ideas come from our senses. And he uses this to be really skeptical of traditional metaphysical concepts like substance, force, power, the self, even God. He asks for each of these ideas what sensory experience gives rise to it. If you can't point to a specific experience, he thinks the idea is either meaningless or needs to be reinterpreted.
And this has a big impact on how he sees Newtonian forces, right?
Absolutely. Because of his science of man, he ends up with a non-realist or maybe anti-realist interpretation of forces. He says terms like force and power only refer to an effect or some other event constantly conjoined with the cause. So we're not really talking about some hidden power behind things, just the regular patterns we observe.
So for Newton, gravity was a real thing, even if it was mysterious. But for Hume, it's more about seeing that objects consistently move towards each other under certain conditions.
Right. We don't actually know why it happens, just that it does. And Hume actually says this explicitly in addition to the treatise. He says we should confine our speculations to the appearances of objects to our senses and not worry about their real nature and operations. He's basically saying that true Newtonian philosophy, the way he sees it, should be grounded in modest skepticism. We have to admit we're ignorant about anything beyond our senses. He even reinterprets Newton's idea of a vacuum this way. It's not about knowing what a vacuum really is, just understanding its observable effects.
So it's almost like Hume's trying to purify Newtonianism. He's taking away the metaphysical parts that go beyond what we can actually observe.
Yeah, and he probably saw himself as fulfilling the true potential of Newton's philosophy by making it more empirical. He seems to have thought that people like Boyle and Newton were on the right track with their focus on observation and experiment, but they didn't always stick to those principles in their own theories.
And this difference in how they view scientific principles connects to Hume's argument about the separation between what we can see and these hidden causal powers, right?
Definitely. Hume says we can't really know anything about these invisible forces except that they're useful for describing and predicting what we observe. Like he uses the example of billiard balls colliding. We see the balls move, but we don't know the powers that make them move that way. All we see is the shape, the color, the motion. There's no reason to assume there's some hidden mechanism behind it all.
So he's questioning the whole idea that science is about uncovering the true nature of reality.
Right. He's skeptical that we can go beyond the surface of things. He accepts that there might be hidden powers, like in Locke's philosophy, but he says the problem of induction shows we can't reliably infer what those powers are just from our limited experience. The source talks about this as a kind of transduction problem. We can't just jump from what we see to what's hidden. He even hints at the problem of multiple realization, which means that different underlying mechanisms could produce the same observable effect.
So even if we see an apple falling, we don't really know what's making it fall. It could be different things that all look the same to us.
Exactly. So for Hume science, even Newtonian science is stuck at the level of describing relationships between things we can see. Terms like elasticity or gravity are just ways to talk about these relationships, not labels for real hidden powers. Even Newton's concept of the vacuum is something we understand through its effects, not through some direct knowledge of reality itself.
So that's a major point of departure between Hume and Newton. Newton wants to explain the true nature of things, while Hume says we should stick to what we can observe. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Hume and Newton, it's clear that their relationship was way more than just teacher and student.
Definitely not.
We saw how Hume initially presented his science of man as being inspired by Newton's success. But then we saw how Hume had mixed feelings about Newton as a person and about the usefulness of his work.
Yeah, and at the core of it all, they had some major philosophical differences, especially about things like causation, the role of theoretical entities in science, the certainty of mathematics, and the limits of human knowledge.
Hume's empiricism and his science of man led him to reinterpret and often challenge some of the most fundamental ideas in Newton's worldview. And that brings us to a final thought for all you philosophy fans out there. Given all of Hume's criticisms and reinterpretations, did his science of man actually succeed in offering a real alternative to Newtonianism? Or did it fail? Think about how relevant Hume's skepticism about scientific realism and the limits of our knowledge still is today. It's something to ponder as we continue trying to understand the universe and our place in it. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you.